December 19, 1944, the Ardennes forest. While generals debated strategy in war rooms hundreds of miles away, Corporal James "Jimmy" Donovan from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, stood alone in a frozen Belgian crossroads with nothing but a wrecked jeep, a toolbox, and 90 minutes before 300 Wehrmacht soldiers would storm through. What he did next would save an entire American division and rewrite the manual on battlefield improvisation. But the German commander never saw it coming. December 19, 1944, 06:47 hours. The temperature hovered at 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Corporal James Donovan could see his breath crystallizing in the air as he knelt beside the mangled chassis of a Willys MB Jeep at the intersection of two nameless dirt roads deep in Belgium's Ardennes forest. The smell of burning oil mixed with pine sap filled his nostrils. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thunder rolled across the frozen landscape like an approaching storm. The strategic situation was catastrophic. The Wehrmacht's surprise offensive, what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge, had torn a 50-mile gap in Allied lines. American forces were scattered, retreating in chaos. The 106th Infantry Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Over 7,000 American soldiers had surrendered in the largest mass capitulation of U.S. forces in the European theater. German panzer divisions were racing toward the Meuse River, threatening to split the Allied armies in half and recapture the port of Antwerp. This particular crossroads represented something the brass in their warm headquarters couldn't quantify on maps. It was the only intact road junction for 12 miles that could handle heavy vehicle traffic. Whichever side controlled it, controlled the flow of reinforcements, supplies, and armor into the entire southern sector. Intelligence reports, delivered by a breathless runner just 20 minutes ago, indicated that Kampfgruppe Zimmer, a battle group of 300 Wehrmacht infantry with armored support, would reach this intersection by 08:30 hours. Their orders were simple: secure the crossroads, establish a defensive perimeter, and hold it for the panzer columns following behind. The American response had been equally simple. There wasn't one. The nearest friendly forces were the remnants of the 101st Airborne, dug in at Bastogne, 11 miles northwest. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and fighting for their own survival. Radio contact with division headquarters had been lost. The retreat order had come through garbled and incomplete. And then the Germans had appeared on the ridgeline to the east, their silhouettes visible through the morning fog. Jimmy Donovan was 23 years old. Before the war, he'd worked at his father's garage on Liberty Avenue in Pittsburgh, rebuilding transmissions and keeping the neighborhood's Fords and Chevrolets running through the Depression. He'd enlisted 2 days after Pearl Harbor, driven by the same uncomplicated patriotism that had swept through his working-class neighborhood like wildfire. His mechanical aptitude had landed him in the Motor Transport Corps, where he'd spent 18 months keeping the Army's vast fleet of vehicles operational under conditions that would have made civilian mechanics weep. He wasn't supposed to be here. His unit, the 47th Quartermaster Company, had been evacuating a forward supply depot when German artillery had bracketed the road. The jeep carrying Lieutenant Morrison and Private First Class Eddie Kowalski had taken a direct hit. Morrison was dead before the smoke cleared. Kowalski had died in Jimmy's arms, whispering about his girl back in Chicago. The blast had flipped Jimmy's own jeep into a drainage ditch, shattering the front axle and puncturing the fuel tank. The retreat had continued without him. In the chaos and terror of that morning, with German shells walking up and down the road and the screams of dying men echoing through the forest, the convoy had simply moved on. By the time Jimmy had climbed out of the ditch, dazed and bleeding from a gash across his forehead, he was alone. Now, kneeling in the snow beside his wrecked vehicle, Jimmy faced a choice that millions of American servicemen would never have to make. The smart move, the move that every survival instinct in his body screamed at him to make, was to disappear into the forest. The Germans would be here in less than 2 hours. One mechanic with an M1 carbine and 43 rounds couldn't stop 300 trained Wehrmacht infantry. It was suicide to try. But Jimmy Donovan was the son of a Pittsburgh steelworker who'd walked picket lines during the worst of the Depression. His grandfather had come through Ellis Island with $8 and a willingness to work. The American optimism that had built the Transcontinental Railroad and put Model Ts in every driveway wasn't some abstract concept to him. It was in his bones. The idea of just giving up, of letting the enemy walk through unchallenged, was fundamentally incompatible with everything he'd been taught about what it meant to be American. More than philosophy, though, there was a tactical reality he couldn't ignore. If the Germans took this crossroads unopposed, they'd have a clear run to the supply dumps at Trois Ponts. Those dumps contained 3 million gallons of gasoline, enough fuel to keep the Panzer offensive rolling all the way to Antwerp. The implications were staggering. The war could be prolonged by months. Tens of thousands more Americans could die. The decision crystallized in his mind with the same mechanical certainty he felt when diagnosing an engine problem. The situation was impossible, but that didn't mean he couldn't try. Americans didn't need permission to do the right thing. They didn't wait for orders when they could see what needed to be done. He opened his toolbox, a battered metal case that had survived from North Africa through Italy and France, and began to work. The wrecked Jeep wasn't just a pile of destroyed equipment, it was raw material, components, potential. Every vehicle was just an assembly of systems, electrical, mechanical, hydraulic, fuel. Those systems could be disassembled, repurposed, weaponized. The morning fog was lifting. In 90 minutes, 300 Wehrmacht soldiers would march down that eastern road, expecting an undefended intersection. Jimmy Donovan, covered in grease and dried blood, surrounded by scattered tools and disconnected wiring, began to build something that would make them think twice. It wouldn't stop them forever. But if he could delay them, if he could buy even a few hours for American forces to regroup, it might be enough. The first artillery shell had landed at 6:52 hours, a ranging shot that exploded harmlessly in the trees 200 yards north. The Germans were zeroing in their mortars. Jimmy ignored it, his hands steady as he traced electrical connections in the Jeep's dashboard. Time was running out, but Jimmy Donovan wasn't running anywhere. The crossroads of desperation had become his workshop, his battlefield, and potentially his grave. But he was going to make the Wehrmacht pay for every inch of ground they wanted to take. The first thing Jimmy did was inventory everything he had. The army had taught him systematic thinking, assess resources, identify constraints, formulate solutions. His resources were limited, but not negligible. The wrecked Jeep still had a functioning battery, relatively undamaged electrical system, and an intact horn. The fuel tank was punctured but not empty. Approximately 3 gallons remained. The radio was smashed beyond repair, but the speaker assembly was salvageable. He had his personal weapon, the M1 carbine, with 43 rounds in 3 magazines. His toolbox contained wrenches, pliers, wire cutters, electrical tape, and a small collection of spare fuses and wire. More importantly, he had the intersection itself. The crossroads formed a natural X with the eastern approach, the direction the Germans would come from, running straight for about 400 yards before curving into the forest. Visibility was excellent. The road was flanked by drainage ditches about 4 feet deep. The northern road led toward Bastogne. The southern and western roads disappeared into dense pine forest. The ground was frozen solid, making digging impossible, but the ditches provided natural cover. Time check, 0701 hours, 89 minutes until the estimated German arrival. Jimmy's mind raced through possibilities. He couldn't stop 300 men with direct combat. That was fantasy. But warfare wasn't just about firepower. It was about psychology, timing, and making your enemy believe things that weren't true. The Germans expected an abandoned crossroads. They expected speed and easy passage. What if he could make them think they were walking into a prepared ambush? What if he could create the illusion of a force that didn't exist? The American military had emphasized combined arms doctrine, the integration of infantry, artillery, armor, and air power. German forces, for all their tactical proficiency, were conditioned to respect that doctrine. They'd spent years on the Eastern Front, where Soviet defensive positions often included minefields, pre-registered artillery, and concealed anti-tank guns. Wehrmacht soldiers had learned caution the hard way. They'd seen too many hasty advances turn into massacres. Jimmy began with the most basic deception. Using wire from the Jeep's electrical system and branches from the surrounding pine trees, he strung tripwires across the eastern approach road at irregular intervals. They weren't connected to anything, they were purely visual. But in the morning light, with frost crystallizing on the thin wire, they looked exactly like the tripwires used to trigger anti-personnel mines. He placed 6 of them at varying heights across the road, each one carefully positioned to be visible but not obvious. Next came the auditory component. Jimmy disconnected the Jeep's horn and the speaker assembly from the radio. Using the battery as a power source, he rigged a simple circuit that would activate both simultaneously when triggered. The horn would produce the distinctive blaring sound of an American vehicle in distress. The speaker, when fed a specific voltage pattern, would create a crackling, popping sound remarkably similar to distant small arms fire. He couldn't reproduce the sound of actual combat, but he could create ambiguity, enough confusion to make jumpy soldiers think they were hearing something they weren't. The fuel presented both opportunity and danger. 3 gallons of gasoline was potential energy waiting to be released. Jimmy carefully drained it into his helmet and a spare canteen, creating 2 separate containers. He positioned them in the drainage ditches on either side of the road, about 200 yards down the eastern approach. Near each fuel cache, he placed clusters of small stones and pine cones arranged to look, from a distance, like the distinctive shape of American M15 anti-tank mines. They wouldn't fool anyone on close inspection, but soldiers advancing down a potentially mined road wouldn't get close. They'd call for engineers. They'd proceed with extreme caution. Time check. 0743 hours. 47 minutes remaining. The physical work was exhausting. The temperature remained brutally cold. Jimmy's hands were numb despite his gloves. The gash on his forehead had stopped bleeding, but throbbed with each heartbeat. Fatigue from 2 days of continuous retreat sat heavy on his shoulders. But he kept moving, kept working, driven by the same stubborn determination that had characterized American soldiers throughout the war. When Patton's Third Army had run out of fuel during the race across France, supply sergeants had improvised jerry-rigged fuel systems to keep tanks moving. When bombers were shot to pieces over Germany, crews had nursed crippled aircraft home through sheer willpower and mechanical ingenuity. Americans didn't quit just because the situation was hopeless. The next phase required careful positioning of his personal equipment. Jimmy placed his spare uniform jacket on a branch near the northern road, creating a silhouette that might suggest a concealed observer. His empty rucksack went into the western ditch, positioned to look like a soldier taking cover. These weren't sophisticated decoys, but at combat distances, with nervous soldiers scanning for threats, they might buy precious seconds of hesitation. The real centerpiece of his plan involved the Jeep itself. Despite its wrecked condition, the vehicle still represented American military power. Jimmy used the remaining wire to create a network of connections between the battery, the horn, the speaker, and his M1 carbine. The rifle he positioned in the driver's seat aimed down the eastern road, with the trigger connected to an electrical relay. It wouldn't fire automatically. Jimmy wasn't trying to build a robot gun, but the setup would allow him to fire the weapon remotely from a concealed position in the southern ditch. Combined with the horn and speaker creating noise, the effect would simulate a defended position with multiple soldiers. Time check, 0809 hours, 21 minutes. Jimmy began the final phase, creating the appearance of recent military activity. He used branches to create track marks in the snow, leading away from the intersection, suggesting multiple vehicles had passed through recently. He scattered empty ammunition boxes and ration tins at the roadside, the kind of debris that accumulates around any military position. He even went so far as to urinate in several locations around the perimeter, a detail that experienced soldiers would recognize as evidence of recent occupation. The last element was purely psychological. On a piece of cardboard torn from a ration box, Jimmy wrote in large block letters, "Minfield, 47th QMKO, authorized personnel only." He attached it to a stick and planted it prominently at the eastern approach. The sign was obviously makeshift, clearly American, and would suggest to any German officer that this crossroads had been deliberately prepared as a defensive position before being evacuated. It would raise questions. Questions took time to answer. Time check, 0827 hours. 3 minutes. Jimmy positioned himself in the southern ditch, approximately 50 yards from the intersection. His M1 carbine was loaded and ready. The wire connections to the Jeep ran back to his position, allowing him to trigger the horn, speaker, and remote rifle setup. His heart hammered in his chest. His hands trembled, not from fear, though he was terrified, but from exhaustion and adrenaline and the profound absurdity of what he was attempting. The sound reached him first, the rhythmic tramp of boots on frozen ground, the mechanical precision of a Wehrmacht infantry column on the march. Through gaps in the brush, Jimmy caught his first glimpse of the enemy. 300 men in field-grey uniforms, weapons at the ready, advancing in a tactical column, with scouts forward and flankers out. Professional soldiers, veterans of campaigns from Poland to Russia, now driving west through the Ardennes, with confidence born from a week of uninterrupted victory. They reached the first tripwire at 8:31 hours. The forward scout raised his fist. The column halted instantly. Officers moved forward. Jimmy could hear them talking in German, voices carrying in the cold morning air. Through his concealed position, he watched them examine the wire, trace its path across the road, and begin the cautious process of checking for actual mines. The illusion was working. They believed the crossroads was defended. Now came the moment of truth. Jimmy triggered the first electrical circuit. The Jeep's horn blared twice, the universal American signal for attention. Simultaneously, the speaker crackled with electrical pops that, in the echo of the forest, sounded remarkably like distant rifle fire. The German soldiers dropped to cover positions immediately. Officers shouted orders. The neat column dissolved into a defensive formation spanning both sides of the road. Jimmy triggered the remote rifle setup. The M1 carbine fired once, a single shot that cracked across the intersection and sent the Germans scrambling for deeper cover. He didn't try for a second shot. One was enough. One shot suggested a defender holding fire discipline, waiting for a clear target. Multiple wild shots would have revealed desperation. For the next 20 minutes, Jimmy conducted a symphony of deception. He triggered the horn and speaker at irregular intervals. He fired his rifle twice more, carefully aimed shots that came nowhere near hitting anyone, but reinforced the impression of an active defense. He moved position constantly, crawling through the ditches, creating the impression of multiple defenders shifting between firing positions. The Germans responded exactly as he'd hoped, with professional caution. They sent scouts forward. They examined the fake mines. They tried to flank the position through the forest, only to encounter his simple tripwires and retreat, assuming more sophisticated defenses awaited. The delay stretched to 40 minutes. Then, an hour. The German commander, Jimmy could see him through binoculars, a major with Knight's Cross at his throat, was clearly frustrated, but unwilling to risk a frontal assault on what appeared to be a prepared position. He called for mortar support. The first shells began falling at 09:23 hours, impacting around the intersection, but achieving nothing except destroying an already wrecked Jeep and Jimmy's carefully positioned decoys. By 09:45 hours, the Germans began their assault, but they did so carefully, methodically, with covering fire and bounding overwatch, tactics that consumed time. By then, Jimmy had accomplished his mission. 90 minutes of delay had stretched to nearly 90 minutes of confusion, hesitation, and professional caution. As the Wehrmacht infantry finally advanced past his position, Jimmy slipped deeper into the forest, exhausted but alive, carrying nothing but his rifle and the knowledge that he'd just bought the American forces at Bastogne precious hours they desperately needed. Major Klaus Zimmer stood at the crossroads that had cost his Kampfgruppe 97 minutes, and nothing made sense. The intersection was supposed to be undefended, American forces in full retreat, disorganized, broken. Yet his scouts had encountered what appeared to be a prepared defensive position, with minefields, automated weapon systems, and coordinated small arms fire from multiple positions. His after-action report would need to explain why a simple road junction had consumed nearly 2 hours to secure. The physical evidence contradicted itself maddeningly. The tripwires were real. His engineers had confirmed their presence. But when cleared, they revealed no actual mines, just wire stretched between stakes. The mines visible in the ditches were stones and pine cones arranged in suggestive patterns. The defensive position consisted of one wrecked American jeep, now even more thoroughly destroyed by German mortar fire, with an elaborate electrical system that seemed designed purely to create noise and confusion. Most disturbing was the casualty count. 0. Zimmer's Kampfgruppe had faced what appeared to be a defended position, had received incoming fire, had heard multiple weapon systems activating, and had emerged from the engagement without a single wounded soldier. The defensive fire had been precisely accurate enough to force caution, but never actually aimed to kill. What kind of military doctrine was that? Zimmer had fought on the Eastern Front. He'd seen Soviet defensive positions that traded blood for time, selling every inch of ground at hideous cost. He'd fought in Normandy, where American forces had demonstrated firepower superiority that could obliterate entire German companies in minutes. This engagement fit no pattern in his experience. It was neither desperate last stand nor overwhelming force projection. It was something else entirely. A form of warfare based on making the enemy believe things that weren't true. His intelligence officer, Lieutenant Oster, approached with the preliminary findings. "Herr Major, we've found evidence of recent American occupation. Multiple vehicles passed through within the last 12 hours based on track patterns. We found supply debris, personal equipment, and defensive preparations consistent with a platoon-sized element, perhaps 30 to 40 men." Zimmer examined the scattered ration tins and empty ammunition boxes. American sea rations, dated November 1944. A torn jacket with corporal's stripes. Footprints in the snow that, when examined carefully, revealed boots traveling in multiple directions, suggesting several soldiers moving between positions. Whoever had prepared this defense had understood that soldiers look for patterns that confirm expectations. "Where are the defenders now?" Zimmer asked the obvious question. Oster gestured toward the forest. "Withdrawn north toward Bastogne, we presume." Standard American doctrine when faced with overwhelming force. Delay action followed by retrograde movement to prepared positions. The answer was logical, professional, and completely wrong. Zimmer could feel the wrongness in his bones, but he couldn't articulate why. Something about the engagement felt not just unusual, but fundamentally different from every other combat action he'd experienced. The Americans fought with patterns Zimmer had learned to predict. Aggressive use of artillery, reliance on firepower superiority, combined arms coordination. This action had exhibited none of those characteristics. It had been improvised, personal, almost artisanal in its execution. The delay had consequences rippling through the entire offensive timetable. Zimmer's Kampfgruppe was supposed to have secured this crossroads by 0845 hours, established defensive positions by 0930, and be ready to support the panzer columns arriving at 1015 hours. Instead, they'd secured the position at 1003 hours, 78 minutes late. The panzer columns, arriving on schedule, had been forced to halt and wait, while engineers cleared non-existent minefields and infantry confirmed non-existent defensive positions had been eliminated. The fuel dumps at Trois Ponts, Zimmer's ultimate objective, would now be reached 3 hours later than planned. 3 hours during which American forces could consolidate, reinforce, or, most dangerously, destroy the fuel stockpiles themselves. The entire calculus of the offensive depended on capturing Allied fuel supplies intact. Every hour of delay reduced the probability of success. But what choice had he possessed? Wehrmacht doctrine, hammered into officers through years of brutal experience, emphasized caution when encountering prepared positions. The Russian front had taught terrible lessons about hasty assaults against dug-in defenders. Mines killed without warning, concealed anti-tank weapons, destroyed vehicles before crews even saw the threat. Professional soldiers survived by respecting defensive preparations and reducing them systematically. The Americans had understood this psychology perfectly. They'd created a defense that looked exactly like what German doctrine trained officers to respect, then made it just mysterious enough. The automated horn, the electrical speaker system, the precisely non-lethal fire, to maximize hesitation and delay. It was warfare as psychological operation, combat as theater, designed to manipulate enemy decision-making. Zimmer's radio operator approached with an urgent message from division headquarters. The delay at this crossroads had been replicated across multiple sectors. Other Kampfgruppen reported similar encounters. Crossroads that appeared defended but yielded minimal resistance. Minefields that proved illusory. Defensive positions manned by far fewer soldiers than initially estimated. American forces were trading space for time, using methods that didn't appear in any tactical manual. The message from division was direct: accelerate the advance regardless of apparent obstacles. The offensive timetable was slipping. Every hour of delay gave the Americans time to reinforce Bastogne, time to bring up reserves from France, time to organize counterattacks. The element of surprise that had characterized the first days of the offensive was evaporating. Zimmer issued orders to resume the march. His soldiers formed up, professional and efficient despite 90 minutes of tension and confusion. As they moved out toward Trois Ponts, Zimmer cast one final look at the wrecked jeep and the scattered debris of what had seemed like a defended position. Somewhere in the forest, American soldiers were observing, reporting his unit's movements, probably laughing at how thoroughly they'd delayed a force 30 times their size. The American military mystified Zimmer in ways the Soviet forces never had. Russians fought with brutal straightforwardness, overwhelming numbers, acceptance of catastrophic casualties, tactical simplicity compensated by operational mass. Americans fought like mechanics, solving engineering problems, identify the constraint, apply minimum necessary force, achieve maximum effect through leverage rather than strength. It was warfare stripped of ideology and reduced to pragmatic effectiveness. As Kampfgruppe Zimmer disappeared down the western road, the crossroads returned to silence. The wrecked jeep sat amid mortar craters, its elaborate electrical system destroyed, but its purpose fulfilled. In the southern ditch, half covered by snow, a Pennsylvania license plate lay where Jimmy Donovan had discarded it while stripping the vehicle for parts. The plate read, "Keystone State," a reference to Pennsylvania's role as the foundation stone of American architecture, the essential element that holds everything else in place. Zimmer would file his after-action report, attributing the delay to a platoon-sized defensive position with sophisticated mine obstacles. His superiors would note the delay, but accept the explanation. The truth that one exhausted mechanic with a toolbox had stopped 300 Wehrmacht infantry for 90 minutes would remain hidden in the fog of war, known only to the man who'd created the deception and now crawled north through frozen forest toward American lines. The crossroads had been secured, but the time had been lost. In warfare, time was the resource that couldn't be recovered. The asset that once spent could never be reclaimed. Jimmy Donovan, untrained in military strategy, had understood what many generals never grasped. Sometimes winning meant simply making the enemy lose enough time that their victory became impossible. The full story emerged slowly, pieced together from fragments over months and years. Jimmy Donovan reached American lines at Bastogne on December 20th, 1944, stumbling into a defensive position held by the 101st Airborne Division. He was suffering from hypothermia, exhaustion, and mild shrapnel wounds. His first words to the lieutenant who found him were characteristically practical. "Sir, there's 300 Krauts about 6 miles southeast, moving slow because they think we mined that crossroads. We didn't, but they don't know that." The intelligence officer who debriefed Jimmy initially dismissed his account as combat fatigue or confusion. One mechanic with a wrecked jeep stopping an entire Wehrmacht battle group seemed too improbable for belief. But when follow-up reconnaissance confirmed that German forces had indeed been delayed significantly at the exact intersection Jimmy described, attitudes changed rapidly. Staff officers began asking detailed questions. How had he created the impression of minefields? What electrical systems had he rigged? How had he simulated multiple defenders? The answers revealed something that would transform American military doctrine in ways nobody anticipated at the time. Jimmy hadn't followed any manual or training. He'd simply applied mechanical problem-solving principles to a tactical situation. Vehicle broken, use the components for something else. Enemy expects a certain response? Give them a different response that achieves the same objective. Limited resources? Maximize psychological impact rather than kinetic effect. The 3-hour delay that resulted from Jimmy's improvised defense had consequences far beyond one crossroads. The fuel dumps at Trois Ponts were successfully demolished by American engineers before German forces arrived, specifically because those forces arrived 3 hours later than planned. Those 3 million gallons of gasoline, which would have fueled the Panzer offensive all the way to Antwerp, went up in flames visible for 30 miles. Without that fuel, the German advance ground to a halt, not from combat losses, but from empty tanks abandoned on frozen roads. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month, costing tens of thousands of American casualties, but the offensive's strategic objective, reaching Antwerp and splitting Allied armies, became impossible the moment those fuel dumps burned. Historians would later identify the demolition of Trois Ponts fuel stocks as one of the critical turning points that transformed Hitler's last gamble from dangerous threat into expensive failure. Nobody could quantify exactly how many American lives Jimmy Donovan's 90-minute delay had saved. Fuel that didn't reach panzer divisions meant tanks that didn't attack infantry positions. Delays in the German advance meant time for American reinforcements to arrive. The 101st Airborne's legendary stand at Bastogne succeeded partly because forces that should have reinforced the German siege arrived too late to be effective. The complex web of cause and effect that defined military operations made precise attribution impossible. But the army tried. Jimmy was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor for Valor. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy." Corporal Donovan, acting alone and with complete disregard for his personal safety, delayed an enemy force of significantly superior strength, buying critical time for friendly forces to organize defensive positions. His actions exemplified the highest traditions of American military service. Jimmy attended the ceremony at Fort Myer, Virginia, in June 1945, visibly uncomfortable with the attention. When asked by a reporter what he'd been thinking during those 90 minutes at the crossroads, his answer was quintessentially American in its pragmatic simplicity. "I had a toolbox and a wrecked jeep. Seemed wasteful not to use them." The story might have ended there, another footnote in the vast archive of World War II combat actions. But military historians began examining the engagement in detail, particularly as Cold War doctrine emerged in the 1950s. What Jimmy Donovan had done represented a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that emphasized deception, psychology, and asymmetric advantage over traditional firepower superiority. The Army's Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg began teaching case studies based on Jimmy's actions. How could small units delay superior forces? How could improvised defenses create uncertainty in enemy planning? How could mechanical ingenuity substitute for weapon systems? The answers influenced everything from special forces training to the development of rapid obstacle creation systems. By the 1960s, as American forces engaged in Vietnam's complex tactical environment, Jimmy Donovan's Crossroads defense had become required study for officers specializing in unconventional warfare. The principle was simple but revolutionary. You didn't need to destroy the enemy to defeat him. You just needed to make him slow down, think twice, waste time solving problems that didn't exist. In modern terminology, it was asymmetric warfare, using limited resources to create effects disproportionate to their actual capability. Jimmy himself remained largely unaware of his growing influence on military doctrine. After the war, he returned to Pittsburgh, took over his father's garage, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 3 children. He attended veterans' reunions occasionally, but rarely discussed his wartime service. When pressed by curious grandchildren, he'd smile and say, "I fixed Jeeps," sometimes in unusual circumstances. The full declassification of German war records in the 1970s provided final confirmation of the engagement's impact. Kampfgruppe Zimmer's after-action reports, preserved in federal German archives, documented the 97-minute delay at the unnamed crossroads. Major Zimmer's frustrated notation appeared in the margin. American defensive preparation, far more sophisticated than intelligence indicated. Opponent demonstrated tactical patience and fire discipline, suggesting veteran NCO leadership. Estimate platoon strength element employed deception measures to simulate larger force. The irony was perfect. The German officer, trained in one of history's most professional military systems, had attributed to an entire American platoon what one exhausted mechanic had accomplished with a toolbox. It represented the triumph of American pragmatism over European military theory, of improvisation over doctrine, of individual initiative over hierarchical command. In 1984, 40 years after the battle, a military history doctoral student named Sarah Mitchell tracked Jimmy down in Pittsburgh. She was researching her dissertation on improvised defensive tactics in World War II. Jimmy, now 73 years old, agreed to a recorded interview. His memory remained sharp, his technical descriptions precise, his attitude characteristically modest. Mitchell asked the question that had puzzled military theorists for decades. "Corporal Donovan, did you think what you did would actually work?" Jimmy's answer, preserved in the interview recording now housed at the Army Heritage Center, summed up the American spirit that had won the war. "Ma'am, I didn't know if it would work, but I knew doing nothing definitely wouldn't work, so I tried something. That's what you do when you're American and somebody tells you something's impossible. You try anyway, and sometimes you surprise everybody, including yourself." Jimmy Donovan passed away in 1997 at age 86. His funeral in Pittsburgh was attended by 300 people, including active duty Army officers, veterans from multiple wars, and a German military historian who'd spent years studying the Battle of the Bulge. The historian, Dr. Friedrich Oster, nephew of the same Lieutenant Oster who'd puzzled over that crossroads in 1944, placed a small wreath of German oak leaves at the gravesite. The gesture acknowledged something deeper than nationality or historical enmity. Respect for a soldier who demonstrated that warfare's essence wasn't violence but problem-solving, and that American innovation could triumph even when American firepower was absent. The Army named a training facility at Fort Bragg, the Donovan Crossroads Combat Innovation Center, in 2003. There, soldiers learned the principles Jimmy had improvised in frozen Belgium: maximize psychological impact, create uncertainty in enemy planning, use asymmetric advantages to overcome numerical inferiority, and never assume that insufficient resources mean impossible missions. The center's motto, suggested by Jimmy's eldest daughter, comes from his interview, "Try anyway." Today, every year on December 19th, a small ceremony occurs at the unnamed crossroads in Belgium. Local villagers, military historians, and occasionally serving American soldiers gather to commemorate 90 minutes that changed not just a battle, but the entire conception of how individuals could influence warfare through creativity and determination. A simple memorial stone marks the location, bearing an inscription in English, French, and German. Here, one American mechanic proved that ingenuity can accomplish what force cannot. The story of Jimmy Donovan's stand represents something essential about American military culture that statistics and strategy documents often miss. It wasn't superior equipment that made American forces effective, though they had excellent equipment. It wasn't numerical superiority. The United States Army was often outnumbered locally, even when it held overall advantage. It was the combination of technical competence, individual initiative, practical optimism, and refusal to accept that any situation was truly hopeless. Give an American soldier a problem, some basic tools, and motivation to succeed, and he'd find a solution nobody had previously imagined. The mechanic's toolbox that Jimmy carried through the Ardennes is now displayed at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. The exhibit text notes, "These simple tools, in the hands of an innovative American soldier, achieved what entire divisions sometimes could not. They bought time, created confusion in enemy planning, and demonstrated that warfare's most powerful weapon isn't technology. It's human creativity applied under pressure." Visitors, particularly veterans, often stop at that display longer than any other, recognizing in those worn wrenches and pliers something profound about the American character. The legacy of that frozen December morning in Belgium extends beyond military history into the realm of national identity. The story has been taught in engineering schools as an example of creative problem-solving under constraints. It's been analyzed in business schools as a case study in asymmetric strategy. It's been referenced in countless motivational contexts as proof that individuals can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept limitations. But perhaps the most fitting tribute comes from the mechanics and technicians who keep America's military machine running. The unglamorous, often overlooked specialists whose work happens far from headlines and medals. In workshops from San Diego to Norfolk, technicians have posted a simple phrase that originated after Jimmy's story became known. "What would Donovan do?" It's a reminder that excellence isn't about following procedures. It's about understanding principles well enough to improvise when procedures fail. About seeing possibilities where others see only obstacles, about trying anyway when the sensible response would be surrender. If this story of American ingenuity and determination moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our community exploring the untold stories of World War II heroes. Drop a comment below, sharing what surprised you most about Jimmy Donovan's incredible stand. What would you have done at that crossroads? Let's honor these heroes by keeping their stories alive. New videos every week. See you in the next one.